I feel like I've been talking about death and funeral practices fairly consistently almost since I came back into congregational ministry 3 years ago. I had 9 years out of congregational ministry. And I have found that funeral practices have shifted radically over those 9 years. And I think some of that is a shift, like many things, that was in progress and then was accelerated by the pandemic and by COVID. So I wanted to tell you why I mean, I think I've already started why I wanted to talk about this today. And it is that feeling of like, oh, feel like I used to know how to do this. And we all knew what this was in terms of what we do after death. And now with a break of 9 years and a shift from, even though I'm like not that far away from where I was in Southwestern Ontario, I've shifted from rural ministry into urban ministry. So when I was in my settlement charge in rural ministry, the way that death looked like was the funeral director would call me and he would say, Michelle, someone has died, and he'd tell me who had died. And then if it was, depending on who it was, that might mean that I was doing a pastoral care visit that afternoon, or it might mean that I was going to wait a day or so, and the family would go to the funeral home, which was like 3 houses down from the church, and they would make their arrangement with the funeral director, and then they would walk down the street, wouldn't even have to move their car, come to the church office, meet with me, and that would be a combination of a pastoral care visit, funeral planning. If it was someone that I didn't know, because in rural ministry, you do a lot of funerals for people you don't know, then I'd be trying to learn enough about the family to do the service. And then they would usually have a day where there was visitation from 2 to 4 and 7 to 9. On one day, yeah, I see some nods. And then the next day, we would have the funeral, maybe around 11 o'clock, because that would allow out of town people time to drive up. We'd have the service, usually in the funeral home, because a service in the church meant that you were thinking that you were a little bit uppity. We only did special funerals in the church. If it was like the death of a young person, we might do it in the community center because nothing else in the village would be big enough. And then we'd go do a quick internment in the cemetery, which was a 5-minute drive out of the village, and then swoop back. Only the family would go to the cemetery, and then we'd come back to eat the best egg salad, salmon, ham and cheese sandwiches at the funeral lunch. And that's just what funerals looked like. The only variation was that sometimes, like maybe twice, I worked with the funeral home in town rather than the one in the village. The sandwiches were the same. The liturgy was largely the same. The practices were the same. We almost always had caskets, usually open caskets or very often still open caskets during visitation, and a burial, occasionally a cremation, but at that time, it was still mostly dead bodies while we were celebrating the life of the person and mourning them and comforting the family. So then I came to London, and my congregation's a little bit younger, so we didn't have, a lot of funerals in the first 6 months I was there. And so then someone died, and I must have gotten a phone call, and they were going to have a service, a celebration of life, because they didn't want a funeral. They were going to have a celebration of life at the funeral home at the other end of town. And I was welcome to stop by if I wanted to and say a prayer. And I was like, well, what? What does that mean? So I was in meetings in Toronto that weekend. So I left early, drove back down the 401, wore my clericals, went to the funeral home, got there. They were doing the celebration of life. It's like the reception, but you haven't had anything before. And there were congregation people there, and I met the family for the first time. And then when it came to, we'll be sharing words and memories at 3 o'clock, the funeral director gets out a microphone and a stand, and he sets it up for anyone to speak. And then turns to me and says, "Okay, Reverend, over to you." And I'm like, uh, over to me? I came prepared with the prayer I was free to offer if I felt like it. And the 23rd Psalm in my back pocket, because God knows you have to have that memorized. And completely unprepared to be leading that section of the day. And also, there was no one in the family who had prepared anything, right? So, God lover, the chair of our UCW, after some amount of silence, gets up and, talks lovingly about the woman from our congregation who had died, and sits down. And then eventually a granddaughter gets up and she speaks for at least 15 minutes from this, like on her phone, from this long thing that she's written about her grandmother. And the family is just overjoyed by these memories of the granddaughter. But I have to tell you, I don't mean this as being critical to the family, but I was just beside myself because it wasn't what I expected. And then I felt responsible. It's like, oh my word, like, what is going on? What is going on? And this was my first funeral experience back in the congregation. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. What is happening? So then nobody else died, right? Until I left town again. And for I swear to God, half the people in this congregation that have died have waited until I've been out of town to do it. And I was actually out of town in Chicago for a personnel committee meeting with the Lutheran deaconesses of the ELCIC and the ELCA. And when I was down there, I went to the Field Museum because it was the opening weekend of a new exhibit, and the new exhibit was all about death. It was all about death. It was about the way our bodies decompose. It was about different ways that cultures have dealt with death. It was about the rituals of death, the containers of death, the way that whales' bodies decompose in the bottom of the ocean. And it was this extraordinary exhibit. It was at the Royal Ontario Museum last year, and I didn't make it to a second time. And then I went, exited through the gift shop. I bought every book in the little exhibit gift shop. They had about, maybe not everyone, but I came out with a huge stack of books that were about death. Because it's so different now. And some of what has made it so different is that the last time I was in ministry, we didn't have medical assistance in dying. And we do now. And that is also shaping death practices. So when my partner's mother died, like, it was scheduled. Like, we flew to Winnipeg for the death. And that really shapes and shifts our death practices too, when you're not like, some of our folks, we know it's coming, but we don't know when. Sometimes death is happening unexpectedly, but sometimes death is happening on a schedule. And that is really shifting things as well. I'm just trying to think, maybe done one funeral, maybe two with a casket since I came back into ministry in 3 years. And one of them was for not even my own congregation, a church that I was covering. I had a funeral, and this is the thing, I would use the word funeral and celebration of life interchangeably, because like someone else said, I think it was Heather, when people describe what they want, I'm like, well, that's what I do. funeral and celebration of life, like that's kind of the same thing. But our funeral homes around here, they're saying things to people like, well, a celebration of life is non-religious and a funeral is religious. And when and I was just being driven crazy by this language around funerals and celebrations of life. And when my dad was dying last year, so he was diagnosed, and 7 weeks later he was dead. And I remember sitting on the back porch with my parents and saying, can we talk about what we want to have happen after dad dies? My father remained averse to talking about his death as something that was happening until the end of his life. Like, he didn't want to have this conversation even when he was actively dying. And they said to me, well, we're thinking we'd like to have a celebration of life and not a funeral. And I was like, oh my God, what does that mean to you? I managed to say it a little bit quieter and gentler to them in the moment, but that was what my inner voice sounded like. And my mom said, well, something not really religious. And then I got to experience from the inside that families who say that don't necessarily know what they mean by it. And they want something, but they don't know what the shape of something is. That it really has forced me to examine the traditional funeral practices that have been so comfortable to me, to think about what parts of those rituals have important functions that I think if we're not doing exactly that shape of the thing, then we need to do something else. So for instance, in my family, I did insist and argue for that we were going to have a time that we were going to do, okay, we'll do 1 to 4, but there's going to be speeches at 3. We're going to have a time when, and we're going, and because I'm a presider, I'm like, and we are not asking just anyone to stand up. We're going to have invited speakers. We're going to have the speakers list. And for myself and my aunts who are religious, I said, for me, it's really important that we have a prayer. I know Dad didn't want it, but I don't want to get through this without it. And I don't think his sisters do either. So we managed to compromise on that. But people don't know what they want. They want something, but they're not sure what that is. And with Matthew's mom's death, we didn't have anything. And that was that has been a different kind of hard. And in that case, we actually don't have a body. We don't have remains because God love her, she donated her body to science. So she is still at the medical school in the University of Winnipeg. And we'll get her back at some point in the next 3 years, and then we'll have some ritual there, but it will just be us. So we've missed that opportunity to have the community storytelling and the comfort from being around folks. So that's why I want to talk about this, because it's all in my experience, it's changing. And I think worth talking about why we did the things we did, why we're still doing some of them, and what are we going to do next when we're not doing things in the same way anymore. So I think we're going to do a lightning round of funeral preferences, and I think Scott has at least one poll for us.
Is this what we want to talk about?
No, this is make a choice right now. We're doing funeral planning, Marcy.
Oh, for my death?
What would you want for your death?
Ah.
Sorry about that. My question wasn't clear. I'm laughing because this looks like a real clergy preference poll to me, especially that we're all like, no open microphone. Although someone did pick it, like and you can get wonderful stories with an open microphone. I have families who say that's really important to them, and we do it. I see singing and in the church as a strong preference, and yet those are two of the traditions that I see shifting away. Although I am finding church families in the city like having the celebration of life in the church. They find that comforting. And I guess open casket is the least favorite option. And I think that's dying out too in a lot of places. Dying out. Oh my goodness. Oh, my partner's laughing at me. That's the other thing, right? Funeral practice is not a monolith. When I was recently graduated, I described to you what the funeral practice was where I was in ministry, but my classmates who were out on the prairies, they were like only doing services that were graveside. In Southern Ontario, they closed all the funerals, the cemeteries down where I am. So, there would be no burials. You'd have the funeral service, but you wouldn't have any burials in the wintertime. And then there'd be like 2 days that the cemetery did all the winter interments. And so you'd have like a day or so of burials, of popping out to the cemetery a couple of times and getting the burials done. Meanwhile, on the prairies, they were digging into the frozen ground all year round. Like they weren't waiting until the summer. And yeah, we do very different things. Sometimes cremation is dominant, sometimes bodies are dominant. And it really depends. And we see as certainly as Canada diversifies, as our congregations and our communities diversify, we've got more diversity of funeral practices happening out there. So another thing that happened in the last couple of years is one of the churches in London has held a couple of like morning or day-long education sessions on death and dying and bereavement and grieving, but more on death and dying. And they've had great speakers. They've had speakers like death doulas and palliative care nurses, and people who are in palliative care come and talk about, and some of it has been like the real like physical bodily stuff that starts happening. And I have to say again, when my dad was dying, I was really glad I'd listened to a palliative care nurse describe like, these are the different kind of patterns we see that when people die. This is when your body starts to shut down, your digestive system shuts down. People stop having interest in food. Then we see these changes. Then we see these changes, some of which I recognized from being a minister and visiting in hospital when people were dying, but others I didn't know about. So really, really grateful for the congregation that has opened up and had these terrific education sessions that have been open to anybody to come. We've also, in our city, we have a group of United Church clergy, well, it's open to everybody, that meets on a regular basis for worship and education. And we were able to have one of the doctors who practices with medical assistance in dying come and speak to us one day about what that was like, which was really helpful. And we also had someone who works as a death doula. So I think she was a nurse originally and now practices, and that's like like people pay her to accompany them through death. That was really interesting to hear about and also really challenging because some of what she talks about in her practice is like, that's kind of what we do. So you start to see that as people have moved away from churches, that there are other professions that are picking up these pieces of what we do. The funeral home that is a block from where I'm sitting in our apartment, they have an officiant on staff. They paid for someone to go and get some training so that they can officiate at funeral services without a minister. So that's new too. 10 years ago in rural Ontario, for sure, that wasn't very common. There were funeral homes starting to have someone to do that. They were often the same people that were doing in Ontario licensed to do weddings in the area. So Ontario's very strict about who can do weddings, officiate there. So those were really helpful, and I think part of why I wanted to talk about it is I think the more we can talk about death and dying and funeral practices, the more equipped we are as the landscape continues to shift around us. Yeah, I think the last things I would say is, from the experiences I've had, which is a lot more people trying to figure out what they want. I realized that, and within my own family, which was also very much like, I don't know how people get through this when they don't have somebody who has some opinions about how this should go. And, um, is that I've realized it's actually starting to look a little more like weddings, and that it's probably helpful if I come to these conversations equipped with a little more of the resources that I tend to do with weddings, which is, here is the order of service I usually do. We'll start from here. Almost everything, but not everything, is up for negotiation. And so that is where I'm moving in my practice, because we're no longer all operating on, we all agree on what the thing is that we're doing, and learning that now I have to resource families in a different way on process. So that's kind of where my practice is shifting to, and like I said, it's really all over the map here, like, and the things that I've realized I need to tell folks that it never would have occurred for me to tell folks. I did a celebration of life a while ago, and when the family came, they I was like, so did you bring the ashes? And they said, no, why would we have done that? And I was like, oh, I guess just because I was expecting like them to be there, like I was like, it never occurred to me to tell you to bring the ashes, because I know you still have them. I know they're in the living room. And also that I've learned that I think one of our roles sometimes is to push families a little bit on, what are you doing with those remains? Because people aren't burying bodies in caskets. They aren't necessarily burying remains in a cemetery or having a plan to scatter them. So I do push a little bit, particularly for families that I have the pastoral or congregational connection to. What are you going to do? I want you to have a plan. Because I personally don't think it's good for everyone to have, vases or boxes full of family remains hanging around for 20 years that then the next generation has to figure out what to do with. And again, it's something that people aren't thinking about necessarily in the moment, but yet another of these things that I'm kind of tacking onto my list of things that people need to be thinking about. The last thing I'll say is our experience in Manitoba and Ontario is that there has been a shift in legislation some time ago, and there are very, very clearly laid out price packages for cremation and body removal that a lot of families are taking advantage of now. So it doesn't mean going into a showroom and picking out a casket and, the funeral services and the commemorative handles and like all of that stuff, right? It's a lot more straightforward, and it's like $1,200 and you're done. But that doesn't include what you're doing with the ashes on at the end of the day. What it does include, in my experience, is some really great checklists and administrative support on notifying the government, notifying Canada Pensions, uh, the checklist of legal stuff that people have to get done, and that administrative support, even if it's kind of brief and just coming in a checklist form from a funeral director or the crematorium or the cemetery. Like, the families I'm dealing with, they don't even have funeral directors, some of them, because they're just going to the crematorium or they're just going to the cemetery and having those arrangements made. But if they can get somewhere that is going to give them at least the checklist and help them with some of the administration, that's really important. Gloria has named about the need for rituals, and that the culture is looking for new rituals. And one of the conclusions I've come to, thinking and wondering about death and funerals and mourning rituals, is that we are some of the people who are the ritualists in the culture. And we have wisdom and experience to bring to this to help people navigate and create the rituals that they need in this time and place to mourn their loved ones. Because as much as I might long for the simplicity of the 2 to 4, 7 to 9 visitation, funeral the next day, egg salad sandwiches to follow, like there's a reason why people are dropping that. And it's because it's not meeting their needs. So thank you so much for rich discussion today.
Thank you,
Thank
Michelle,
you.
and thank you everyone for coming.